Assalamu alaikum everyone. Just setting up. Give me a couple of seconds and we can get started, inshallah. Can you, is there any way to communicate with them? Do you have insight into their comments here?
I'm looking at their comments.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Can you just drop a yes? Huh? Okay. I'm here? Okay. Can you guys hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up? Yes? Am I getting yeses?
They're posting the comments.
Okay. Okay. Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is the first live session. You might be wondering what this is. This is just props in our studio, inshallah. I can even put you on this side so you're less bothered by the chrome background here. I am going to go through some of the written questions, and as you guys, put in more questions, I will be seeing them and try to address as many of them as I can, inshallah. So the first question that I'm getting here is, and by the way, I'm really making dua and hoping that you're enjoying the study that we're doing of this, the order and sequence of the Quran. I really did enjoy teaching the course. So is Mathani or Al-Mathani the word for the 7 long surahs in the Quran? That is, I believe, some people's opinion. I do hold that it's referring to the Fatiha. Allah knows best, but the ayah, وَلَقَدْ أَتَيْنَاكَ سَبْعًا مِنَ الْمَثَانِي وَالْقُرْآنِ الْعَظِيمِ, the 7 grand ayat, meaning the Fatiha, unlike which nothing has ever been given before, and then continuing from it the rest of the Quran. So Allah put the Fatiha in a place all of its own in the Quran, and that's what the term Mathani is referring to. The second question is a really interesting one. Who gave different names to surahs? So it's very clear that in some cases the Prophet ﷺ would refer to surahs with certain names. So in those surahs, there's no doubt about it that it's referring to something that Allah Azza wa Jal, it's inspired by Rasulullah ﷺ. So we can say that it's considered part of revelation. But it's also very clear that the Sahaba would refer to virtually any surah with multiple names. And it seems as though they were using keywords or things that reminded them of that surah and turning them into the name of that surah. Surah Al-Baqarah seems to be because it refers to the cow, and that's a unique story in it that's not mentioned anywhere else, so it becomes Surah Al-Baqarah and things like that. Or something really prominent about Surah Ali Imran is the fact that Ali Imran is mentioned in it in that way. So it seems that the Sahaba would actually, I'm reminded of even Surah Abasa, right? Abasa is the first word in Surah Abasa, but also some Sahaba used to call it Surah Abdullah ibn Maktoum, the Surah of Abdullah ibn Maktoum, right? So they would actually look at keywords or reminders from that surah and then refer to it in that way. So that's the story behind the names of the surahs. I don't particularly put too much stock into analyzing a surah based on its given name. Like, for example, just because Surah Al-Baqarah is called Baqarah, I wouldn't say that everything in the surah revolves around the story of the cow and things like that, because I don't believe that's fundamental, nor is it necessarily revelation. Even if the Prophet ﷺ gave it that name, it may be that he gave it that name because it's how the Sahaba recognize it in that way. So it's possible that that's the case. Who used the word surah for the first time? I believe Allah gave that word to the Prophet ﷺ. I mean, it's used in the Quran several times. If you're referring to who used it in Islam for the first time, that it is a unique term to Islam. Like before Islam, no body of literature was called surah, and that is something Allah Azza wa Jal gave uniquely. It does get covered in the course, the meaning of the word surah from sur, a large wall, the outer bounding wall of a city, and things. And it is unique chapters of the Quran that are really, I'm wrong in calling them chapters because they encompass so many different subjects in one, right? So the word surah is in fact a unique term for a body of literature that's in the Quran. Ayat were not called ayat in that way before. And surahs were not called surah. Chapters were never called surahs before. So I would say the use of the word in this way is actually unique to the Quran. As a matter of fact, surah, for something very high and elevated and noble, is found in the language of the Arabs. They use the word surah for manzilatun aliyah, or a very high place or a very high status. So the word surah is found in those usages before Islam, but it was never used for words, and it was never used certainly for revelation before. The Quran itself says Suratun anzalnaha, for example, Surah An-Nur in the beginning, a surah that we sent down. So Allah refers to that directly Himself. The history behind why 114 surahs or 30 chapters. I don't know the answer to why there are 114 surahs. That's Allah's wisdom. I can't really say why, for example, Fatiha has 7 ayat or Baqarah has 286. The why to that really isn't known by anyone. That's just the wisdom of Allah Azza wa Jal, of the size and the number of ayat and the number of surahs in the Quran. There are no 30 chapters. I think you're referring to the 30 ajza later on in Islamic history, kind of inspired by the idea that the companions of the Prophet ﷺ used to recite the entire Quran once in a week, right? So they would read 1/7 of the Quran, then 1/7, then 1/7, then 1/7. And so in 7 days they'd finish reciting the entire Quran. Later on, there was this notion that if you can't recite the whole thing in 7 days, at least you can recite it in 30 days, in a month. So it was divided into 30 parts. The Quran was divided into 30 ajza. And the idea behind the ajza was 30 equal parts roughly in a 604-page mushaf, roughly 20 pages each juz. And it's not a subject division, it's not a logical division, it's not division by, well, this ayah is not connected to the rest of the ayat or anything like that. It's not revealed division, which is why a lot of, and the names of the ajza, we don't just say juz 1, 2, 3, 4, or the Urdu speakers, they say pehla separa, dusra separa, tisra separa, things like that. But a lot of times the names of the ajza are the first phrase of the ayah of that juz. So first one's called Alif Lam Mim, second one's called Sayaqul, third one's called, Lan Tanalu, or Tilka Rusul. And then, so when you look at it like that, well, sometimes it's kind of obscure name. Sayaqul, he will soon say, or Wama li, and what is wrong with me is the name of a juz, a sipara. Like, so they don't really make logical sense, but the logic behind that was maybe somebody can read the Quran for 30 days, one juz a day, and they can finish an entire reading of the Quran in a month. So that's kind of an ijtihad of the Quran. It has certainly no value as far as revelation is concerned. While the Quran was revealed, the Prophet ﷺ would know exactly where which verse would come. Did the Sahaba learn it the same way? Like many surahs were being revealed, were the Sahaba learning multiple surahs at the same time? I do not believe all the Sahaba were learning all the surahs at the same time. Some were learning it and very few were memorizing it. Like some Sahaba were dedicated to memorizing the Quran. Others heard the message of it and they were learning dispersed. Like very telling that, I was making reference to something that Aisha radiallahu anha said about the Prophet. And she said that, when this is like in 16th year of revelation, she said, La aqra'u kathira min al-Quran. I didn't know a lot of Quran. Even then, she didn't know a lot of Quran. So not every Sahabi was constantly studying the Quran. They knew what they knew and they were doing, the work, and they were getting exposed to the ayat, but that doesn't mean every Sahabi was memorizing everything that was being revealed. So yeah, some Sahaba did. Sahaba Sufaf certainly did. And there were people dedicated to learning that, and they certainly did. When there's a narration about, and by the way, I should say that about the history of the companions and how exactly they received the Quran, we have bits and pieces, but you have to appreciate that the Sahaba radiallahu anhu ajma'in were people that lived in this town in the middle of the desert that were not historians, and they didn't know that their names are going to be remembered for thousands of years to come, for centuries and centuries to come, and will become the volumes of scholarship will be dedicated to their names and what they did. They didn't know any of this, right? So they were just experiencing the book, and they weren't documenting in that way everything that's happening, We have, alhamdulillah, some commentary on from them about one ayah or this ayah or that ayah or some conversations they had, but what actually happened in those 23 years is a lot more than what we have documented. We have like snippets, like little glimpses into the actual lives to actually be able to relive the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, to be able to see everything. Like we have these fragments, I want to see the whole story, and I want to relive the entire story. May Allah Azza wa Jal grant us His Jannah by His mercy. Um, Well, when there is a narration about some companions having mushaf with different order, is that just an oral tradition, or is it mentioned in any authentic narration? There are narrations that we don't necessarily question. They have some degree of authenticity that mention. I don't know if you guys are far along in the course yet, where you're discussing the historical complexity and how there were Sahaba that had, it is attributed, for example, to Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, a little bit different order. Ali radiallahu anhu, there's some documentation of that. It's not exhaustive documentation, but we certainly have some historical record that they had different surahs, orders here and there. But they're few and far between. And if you were going through the lectures, you saw how we're supposed to think about that and how we're supposed to deal, with those variations. As far as I'm concerned, I'll repeat it: the exception proves the rule. Like the fact that the Sahaba they were not compilers of books, not even of the Quran. They were doing a personal project for themselves, and you don't necessarily have the luxury of ordering things in a certain way. You can't necessarily say that this order is what they believe to be the divine order. It's just what they had with them, the record that they had with them. Editing and reordering and restructuring words is not easy for the ancient times. That's something easy for us to do with typesetting and editing and things like that. It makes sense that the order of surahs are divine, but what about the names of surahs? I addressed that. I know some of them were given by the Prophet. Was there evidence and argument for all? No, there is no evidence that all of them are divine. I can't be convinced of that position. Allah knows best. Well, it's like I was mentioning, it's I believe that the Sahaba popularized the name of that surah by the prominent or unique story mentioned in that surah. That surah is significant, and that story particularly is significant, and it's something that doesn't recur. Like, unlike the story of Adam alayhi salam or Ibrahim alayhi salam or other things in Baqarah that happen other places, the Baqarah itself never happens anywhere else, right? That doesn't occur anywhere else. So it's often the thing that really makes that surah unique is what kind of becomes its name. That seems to be the explanation. And some have taken it further. I can't deny that. Some have said, well, you know what, we have to look at the entire surah from the point of view that it's this story and the lessons from the story that inform our study of the rest of the entire surah. Though I respect that position, I don't hold that position, but I certainly acknowledge that position is there. I have read some articles which say that there's coherence between ayat which have similar wordings. For example, there are 3 ayat in the Quran which have in nasha nunazzil alayhim min as-sama'i ayatan fadallat a'naquhum laha khadi'in in nasha nakhsif bihim al-ard in nasha nughriqhum. So there is a type of progression between these ayat. First it mentions the sky, then earth, and water. The author mentions dozens of examples of this kind of coherence. Also, Mustansir Mir mentions in his book Coherence in the Quran that some ulama believe that ayat which talk about the same subject are coherent in themselves. For example, all ayat which talks about inheritance, riba, and alcohol. What are your thoughts on this? Are these opinions valid? These are really interesting questions, and these are areas of exploration of the nazm of the Quran that I think are open-ended, that there's a lot possible to be discovered. I do hold the view that phrasing that's similar in the Quran may be it can only be deliberate by Allah Azza wa Jalla. Like in nasha as a phrase, as a piece of a phrase, would have to have some deliberate connection. It's a mental connection to other parts of the Quran. Allah intended for the Quran to be memorized, so someone who memorizes Quran can't help but think in nasha is there and it's there, right? So that's something that deliberately Allah triggered between one place to the other. And if an author is trying to find some sort of a coherent connection between those, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. The other interesting thing is also even between mutashabihat. I was just studying. I'm working on the structure of Ali Imran nowadays, and Allah Azza wa Jalla says, "Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu taqullaha haqqa tuqatihi wa la tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun." And even the phrase "la tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun" is a recurring. It's an echo of something that was mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah. But when it was mentioned in Al-Baqarah, it was on the tongue of Yaqub and Ibrahim alayhim salam, meaning at their deathbeds, they told their children, "Ya baniya inna Allah astafa lakum ad-din, fala tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun." This is what they said to their kids. Don't you dare die except that you're in a state of Islam. And in Surah Al-Imran, Allah says to us directly, not quoting anybody else, He says directly to us, have taqwa of Allah as He deserves to be cautious of, and then don't you dare die except that you're in a state of Islam. So those are the two comparisons, but interestingly in Al-Imran, where Ibrahim alayhi salam is not being quoted, right before then is a discussion of Ibrahim alayhi salam and his true religion and who he really was. And after that, Allah turns to us and says, don't you die except in a state of Islam, meaning it's picking up from where what was left off with the quote of Ibrahim alayhi salam. He was just telling his kids, but now Allah is telling us what Ibrahim alayhi salam said. Right? So He took the words of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and now this time He made them His own words in Surah Al-Imran. So there's a progression of and reinforcement of how the religion of Islam is actually a reestablishment of the religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So it's a really beautiful bit of coherence between those two small snippets of ayat. So there is, certainly tons to be explored on this. I may have mentioned it in the course. I don't think, if I didn't, I'll tell you guys now. I think one of the areas of coherence that really deserves a lot of inquiry, like we have to be very curious about, is examples in the Quran, and how examples in the Quran are actually, I believe, they're progressive images. Like if the parallel is given about light and darkness in Surah Al-Baqarah, and there's another parallel of light and darkness, a parable given of light and darkness in Surah An-Nur, they're actually progressively connected to each other. And that's something that I'd like to explore. And hopefully my next seminar is actually going to be dedicated to parables and examples. And yet it's within the larger subject of coherence, but it's zooming in on one aspect of it, which is the parables and the imagery in the Quran. There's a few examples of that I've seen that seem very compelling and warrant that it should be explored further. The Quran is divided into 7 portions. Hizb are these portions from the wisdom of Allah. If yes, then it has also order like every ayah, passage, surah has. Does the first portion include Fatiha? If it does, then how it fit in the mathematical miracle you mentioned. If it doesn't, then what is the divine logic of keeping separate from the rest of the portions? I do believe that the Ahzab are how the Sahaba used to recite the Quran. I don't know if it's divine order necessarily, and Allah Himself separated the Fatiha, as if to say it is the opening to everything else you recite, and that's what we did in the prayer, right? The prayer is essentially Quran. The Salah is Quran. Why do I know that? Allah calls the Salah Quran. أقم الصلاة لدلوك الشمس إلى غسق الليل وقرآن الفجر. Now think about Salah. Salah, anytime you're going to recite whatever, you're going to recite Fatiha, then you're going to recite some Quran, right? So the Quran became, its spirit became that first you engage the Fatiha and then some portion of the Quran. And that spirit of it is even captured in the ayah. I've given you these 7 grand, highly praised ayat, and I've given you the rest of the Quran with it. Meaning this and then the rest, this and then the rest. Why? So you remind yourself every time that you're seeking guidance from this book. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. That's at the heart of it. You're supposed to be grateful for this book. You're supposed to come to it as a slave, as abd. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You're seeking Allah's help when you're coming to this book. Orient your attitude, and now study some part of the Quran. So it's like every time we study, just like before Salah, you prepare yourself for the Salah by making wudu. Within the Salah, you prepare yourself for whatever portion of the Quran by engaging the Fatiha. Right? So the Fatiha mentally prepares you for whatever guidance Allah is going to give you from whatever portion of the Quran. So that seems to be the logical explanation to me of separating the Fatiha from the rest of the Quran and creating this relationship between those two. Allah knows best. In the Quran, Allah tells us about the debate between Musa and Fir'aun. Are the words used by Musa and Fir'aun? No, they're not. They're certainly not, because Musa alayhi salam spoke at least three languages to my knowledge. Musa alayhi salam is an Israelite, so he speaks, Hebrew. Musa alayhi salam ended up in Madian, which is Arab land, and he married an Arab woman, so he speaks Arabic, and he was raised in the Egyptian palace, which means he speaks ancient Egyptian, a language dead and long gone. Um, I also believe that the debate that he had with Fir'aun must have been in the language of Fir'aun, meaning it must have been in ancient Egyptian. So Allah is translating in the Quran. And Allah is translating not just Fir'aun and Musa alayhi salam, but He's possibly translating Adam alayhi salam and Ibrahim alayhi salam and Nuh alayhi salam. Not all these prophets are speaking in Arabic, right? They're speaking whatever languages they were, Babylonian, ancient Babylonian by Ibrahim alayhi salam. Or, with Zakaria alayhi salam, probably Hebrew, because they're Israelite prophets. They're not Arab prophets, they're Israelite prophets. Or Yusuf alayhi salam is speaking in Hebrew. Quran is translating their words. Now, here's the thing. You probably heard the notion lost in translation, right? So the idea that when you translate something from one language to another, something is necessarily lost. The power of it is lost, some of the meaning is lost, some of the texture is lost. When you listen to poetry in Persian and you translate it into English, it doesn't have the same kick. When you listen to something Quran, right? You listen to the Arabic Quran and you try to listen to an English translation, there's a world of a difference between the two, especially if you know Arabic. There's no way you can taste what just happened in the Arabic and anything else. Some of you have an appreciation for poetry, and poetry in any language translated is just not the same. It's not the work of art or has the effect. And language isn't just about communicating words and meanings. It's about having an impact, and that impact is lost. But we're talking about Allah translating. Allah translating. Allah, the owner of all languages. And what I believe, Allah knows best, is that Allah Azza wa Jal translates in a way that human beings cannot. Human beings can translate words for words. Allah Azza wa Jal translates words, environments, realities, emotional states, things that are beyond the spoken, that couldn't even have been captured if you had the original language. Allah translates beyond that when He takes the words of Fir'aun or the words of Musa alayhi salam and puts them in His Arabic Quran. That's what I believe. So, when you are paying attention to the dialogue between Fir'aun and Musa, then the tension in Fir'aun's voice, the nervousness that he's feeling, the anger that Allah captures so much of it inside His words. He packages it inside, and which is why He chose this rich language, I believe, the language of the Arabs, because it's rich and it's full of imagery and it can capture a lot of meaning in a few words. And so its depth allows for Allah Azza wa Jal to open up so much of His divine wisdom in how He translates from different languages and from different contexts into His book. It's Tafsir Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhuma that is today authentic. What are the earliest tafsir books found today and are authentic? Tafsir Ibn Abbas is practically a golden standard, right? But the challenge is that in the study of Tafsir Ibn Abbas, Sheikh Suhaib, our resident scholar will tell you, and inshallah probably I'll have him do some courses on Quran seminar too. It's a complicated study. Sometimes you find conflicting opinions coming from the same companion, and it's hard to see which one is authentically attributed to them. So that's a second level of research. Unlike the science of hadith, in which there's so much rigor, attributing opinions to the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, there's some level of rigor there, but not nearly like there is in hadith studies. So it requires a lot more depth and research. But I will say something about the tafsir of Sahaba in general, in the earliest tafsir. You have to understand that the Sahaba were contemplating the meanings of the Quran, and they were telling you very briefly something that comes to mind as they study this ayah. And so you'll find their commentary being one word or two words. It's not exhaustive comment. Like a mufassir today will write 6 pages on an ayah. But Ibn Abbas will say two words about that ayah. Why is that? It's because, first of all, they're talking to people that have lived that context, right? So they can say little, and the rest of it, the listener can fill in the blanks. So even though they're saying a couple of words, they're saying a lot more. An example of that would be like, you know, in Surah Luqman, Allah Azza wa Jalla describes people who sell, now this is interesting, like, or purchase. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَشْتَرِي لَهْوَ الْحَدِيثِ لِيُضِلَّ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. Okay, so it's an interesting phrasing in the ayah. Someone who purchases vain speech, useless speech, so he can misguide from Allah's path. It's an obscure phrase a little bit. Purchases vain speech to misguide from Allah's path. And if you look at the tafsir of some of the Sahaba, they said this is referring to music. Fine, it's referring to music. But what about music is this talking about? That's really the question. What this is referring to is there were people at the time of the Prophet ﷺ who, when the Quran was being recited, they knew the kind of impact it has on people. So they said, لا تسمعوا لهذا القرآن وألغوا فيه لعلكم تغلبون. Don't listen to this Quran. Make a lot of noise when it's being recited. Distract people. Best way to distract people, let's pay some money to these singers, these dancers, these women, and get them to start a street show right where the Prophet ﷺ is reciting Quran. Everybody's attention is going to go there, and that way we can deviate people away from what he's saying. Now that scene, how were people taken away from the Quran? By this dancing and singing. And so in one word, he says this is referring to music, but actually it's referring to an entire scheme of the kuffar where they're taking people away from the recitation of the Quran by taking people towards this. And that's the scene that he's describing, not a word. So sometimes the opinions of the Sahaba need a deeper look so you appreciate what's actually going on before arriving at a conclusion. How is the division of the Quran into 7 parts different between Islahi and what you mentioned from a hadith? They are very different. I mean, the schemes are very different. Islahi rahimahullah essentially argued that every group starts with a Makki, ends with a Madani, right? That's his scheme, and then he kind of extrapolates a thematic overview of each of those 7 and tries to connect them together. I personally, though I find his argument interesting, I don't find it entirely convincing, which is why I didn't speak so much about it. I dedicated this course to really talking about what I find the most convincing arguments on the Nadhm of the Quran, but of course you're free to look deeply into his view on this. Some of the arguments he makes I find very compelling, others not so much. So the division of 7 and then the overarching views of the 7, you could look at it other ways, you know. And the thing about Quran is it's such an intricate landscape, right? Dr. Akram told me one time, when you look at the Quran, it's like you're looking at a valley and there's mountain, river, tree, you know, waterfall. There are all these things in the landscape, and they seem like they're all over the place, but somehow they come together and they're beautiful, right? So to describe this entire thing as one thing is very difficult. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot of intricacy there. So that would be my take. And you know, the difference is obviously is there, and actually something he's himself talked about in his introduction. Doesn't Surah Az-Zumar 39:28 explicitly say that the Quran has order? Let me look at the ayah so that I can comment on it. Let me open it up. Hold on. Yeah, I'm not digital. '23, not 24. Sorry. I gotcha. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه الجلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم قلوبهم إلى ذكر الله You're saying kitaban mutashabihan mathaniya is referring to the order? Consimilar, paired. Um, you can interpret that as possibly coherence, but I don't think you can make the argument explicitly based on those ayat. I mean, theoretically, you can make the argument just by Allah using the word kitab that it's in order, because a kitab has to be in order. So you can look at it that way too. Um, Mutashabihan could also refer to he sent something that has similarities within it, but it could also be that it resonates previous revelations, and that it has great praises, mathaniya. So it could be a number of things that are meant by that ayah. Um, Quran is heavenly ordered. Okay. Is it okay if I change the order of the surahs to help me memorize them? Dude, what do you mean help? Okay, for learning purposes, for example, memorizing short surahs, then moving. Yeah, that doesn't mean you're changing the order of the surahs, dude, or dudette. No. You can memorize Surah Al-Nas and then memorize Surah Al-Baqarah. It's all good. That doesn't mean you change the order of the Quran. Relax. That's a really poorly worded. Go easy on yourself. You're not. Nobody can change the order of the Quran. Okay. Okay. Allah uses the words in the Quran, people of the book, like in Surah Al-An'am, ayah 118. To whom actually Allah refers to? Is it the people of the Quran? No, it's the people of the previous scripture. Ahl al-Kitab is people of reading and writing, which were the Jews and the Christians. That's what he's referring to, and they were known as that in the Arab lands because they were the only ones that were literate. Most people other than them were not literate, so they were people of the book. They had a book, they had revelation, and they studied that revelation. They were scribes, they were ahbar, people of ink, and so they were called people of the book. And the book referring to the previous scripture and revelation. Why is tadabbur on the Quran important? People in today's society would argue they could gain similar insights and appreciation through self-reflection and meditation. I don't deny that self-reflection and meditation will give you profound insights, but human insights and divine insights are two different things. And as a matter of fact, if you are someone who meditates and self-reflects, then you will find in the Quran something resonating in your soul that you never found before. As people that most benefit from the Quran and tadabbur on the Quran are people of reflection and self-reflection and meditation anyway. It's the people like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, who was quiet and reflective and meditative, that when he heard the Quran, it struck something in him. They were already people of light, and then the revelation comes and hits another light on them, and that's nurun ala nur. So tadabbur of the Quran is it's actually, it fulfills a longing that we have inside of ourselves. We can, human beings, when they reflect, they find questions, and when you reflect on Allah's word, you start to find healing answers to those questions. At least I'm speaking from personal experience. When I was looking for answers and I was, neck deep in philosophy, my philosophical entanglements were, undone like one knot after the other by my study of the Quran, because of the guided help of my teacher. Just, I wasn't even asking the question and it was getting answered, And so tadabbur of the Quran is that أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا, or do their hearts have their own locks placed on them? It is a spiritual endeavor. And yeah, people can say, I get my spiritual high from yoga or from, just therapy or what. Yeah, sure, you'll get something out of it. I don't deny that. I don't deny that at all. But getting divine inspiration and divine healing, we can never compare that to human effort. Okay. The meaning of the Quran change when you take the coherence into account? If so, does that not mean that the Sahaba would not have the full meaning of the surah or passage because they didn't receive it that way? It's a really good question. So here's my response to that. By the end of Revelation, all of the Quran was understood, and the meanings of the Quran is in fact in layers. I don't think the meaning changes, but certainly you get a more and more and more and more of an appreciation of the text. And things that were necessarily dependent on each other, meaning coherence dependent, were revealed in bunches. Like they were not revealed piecemeal; they were revealed together, so you can see them together. Um, you have examples of entire surahs coming down at the same time because parts of them, if only part of them was revealed, it would create confusion. It would answer the whole thing. But the thing about tadabbur, and this is actually an important place to bring this up, understanding a physics book is either you get it or you don't. Understanding a math book is either you get it or you don't. Understanding literature and understanding especially heavenly, divine literature is not, oh, I get what this ayah is saying, Allah is one, He created the sky. Obviously, I understand what that means, we can move on. Or the Pharaoh said this, Musa said this, we can move on. Or, he struck the staff and the water parted, we can move on. Wait, why did Allah say this? Why did He say it here? And what does that signify for this particular speech? Like, the exercise of tadabbur is an ongoing, non-stop exercise. Now, let's take a step back and really appreciate what's going on here. The best interpretation of the Quran, the best mufassir of the Quran, would be the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You ever ask yourself, how come he doesn't comment on every single ayah of the Quran? I mean, he's responsible for teaching the Quran more than anyone else. You don't find under every ayah of the Quran a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, this is what he meant, 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 this is what he meant. Here are the lessons from this ayah, here are the lessons from this ayah, here are the lessons from this ayah. He didn't do that. He didn't do that. What do you find? You find numerous attempts, numerous exercises of the companions to try to understand its meaning. And by the way, even they disagreeing among themselves. Study Nazi'at, you find them finding 20 different opinions on one word. What could it mean? 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 And that's early revelation, which makes you think, why didn't they just go to the Prophet ﷺ and say, can you just tell us what it means? Because we're all thinking different things. And this is an early surah. It's not even like one of the last surahs. Oh, I wish I had a chance to ask the Prophet ﷺ what it meant. Nope. These are early revelations, and you find tons of opinions of the companions. You have to ask yourself why this is. Allah Azza wa Jal gave this book, and He demanded from the people who engage in this book that they must reflect. If the Prophet ﷺ reflected on the ayat of the Quran, two things would have happened. One, his life would have had to be a lot longer because this is an endless ocean. And if his tafsir would have been, it would have been long, his lifespan would have been longer than Nuh alayhi salam, and may be still ongoing because the depth of the Quran is not something you can cover. No matter how much we contemplate, we'll only get drops of wisdom. And if the Prophet ﷺ was doing that, then there's no end to that. Secondly, if he did it, then we would never reflect on the Quran again. Because after he's spoken what this means, there's no way you and I can say, what else could it mean? What more could be there? That cannot be the case. Allah wanted the reflection on the Quran to be a necessary engagement with the Quran for generations to come. Why are there hundreds of tafasir? Why are there people dedicating their life to study the Quran and coming to different conclusions, and yet they're not finding that their conclusion is in contrast or in conflict with somebody else's, but it enhances or furthers or looks at the same thing from a different angle? I like to think of it like this. I'm looking at the same ocean, you're looking at the same ocean, somebody flying in the plane is looking at the same ocean, somebody standing at the beach is looking at the same ocean, somebody in a submarine is looking at the same ocean, somebody out at sea is looking at the same ocean, but their angle is different, their point of view is different, what they can appreciate about it is different, right? But they're still looking at the same ocean. We're looking at the same book, but we're reflecting on it based on what we have in our hearts, what experiences Allah gave us, and we are looking at the information that Allah has given us. We have to be true to the word, but tadabbur is beyond just, it's more than tafsir. The tafsir, there's no difference. The Sahaba understood the tafsir, this is what the ayah means, Allah is one, Musa alayhi salam was sent to Fir'aun, etc., etc. Nuh alayhi salam delivered his message to his people. These are the basics, these are the black and white element. But then there's a deeper appreciation of the text. That's tadabbur. There's a falling in love with the wisdom behind these words. They literally tadabbur, the word dubur, what is behind these words. That exercise is priceless. That exercise will be ongoing forever and ever and ever. And that's a blessed exercise. And to abandon that exercise is to abandon the spirit of the Quran itself. Anyhow, so how do we try to benefit or find a balance in getting the message or lesson instead of getting involved in details, orders, nahu, stuff? I don't think order is just a detail. I think Farahi made a pretty heavy argument about that, and I do agree though with you that and this is something I've suffered from. You can become overly academic and lose the spirit of the Quran itself. In your personal life, I think, and in my personal life, there needs to be a time where we're just reciting the Quran for worship purposes. We're reciting it. It's just you, the Abd of Allah, reciting the word of His Master, and there's no nahu, there's no sarf, there's no tadabbur, there's no nazm, there's no vocabulary research, there's no what did Ibn Abbas say, what did Ibn Kathir say, what did Qurtubi say, what did Tabari say, nothing. It's just you and the word of Allah, you and the word of Allah. And then there's a portion of your relationship with the Quran that is intellectual, that's engaged, that's reflective. There's a portion of your relationship with the Quran that's asking a lot of questions, and you have to balance these portions out. You have to have a balance, and I have to have a balance, because if we don't, we'll become either like the Jews or like the Christians. The Jews became overly academic, the Christians became only spiritual, right? And we are both. الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض. They remember Allah standing, sitting on their sides, and they think deeply about the creation of the skies and the earth. So remembering Allah is spiritual and reflecting is intellectual, and we're both with the Quran. And so that's, and hopefully that's the balance that we find. By the way, halaqat of the Quran, gatherings in which we sit and remember Allah's word and contemplate Allah's word, they're actually really spiritually and intellectually beneficial, in my experience. Allahu A'lam. Assalamu alaikum, Ustaz Numan. What are your views on the mathematical patterns in the Quran, specifically pertaining to the chapter numbers and the number of verses in each chapter, pointing to a divine order and structure? The problem with that is that there are different views of where the ayah ends, and sometimes there's like 2 ayat are considered 1, and some consider them 2, and so there's no overarching agreement on that. So I don't put too much stock into that having divine order or divine purpose. But some people have discovered some interesting things. I think they're interesting, but I don't put too much stock in it. Personally, I don't. I'm not dismissing it, but it's not my cup of tea. I don't drink tea, chocolate milk. It's not my mug of chocolate milk. What are your thoughts about the Western academics like Madigan? I'm not going to even pronounce that name. Jeffrey, who see the word kitab in the Quran as meaning divine command or Jewish Christian style scripture, but not book per se. I haven't contemplated that, and I haven't read their view on this, so I'm going to look at it some more before I comment. I don't know. I'll ask some of my Western academic study friends, inshallah, about that. How and when were surahs categorized into Mecca and Medina? By the Sahaba's opinions, really. I mean, when the early generations, and I don't know when exactly that happened, but typically, Sabab al-Nuzul studies are actually at least maybe a century later. I'll ask Sheikh Suhaib that question for you guys. Maybe in the evening QA session, by that I'll have the answer for you for that. Meccan versus Medina issue. Why does Surah At-Tawbah not start with a Bismillah? Well, because Allah didn't want it to, but from what I can appreciate about the surah, it is the surah of the culminating punishment on the Quraysh, when the doors of Rahmah were briefly closed by Allah, and finally the nation had to be destroyed. The way I like to think of it is that the missing Basmala in Surah At-Tawbah is one of the greatest mercies of Allah in the Quran. I know that sounds oxymoronic. Let me explain. Allah sent prophets as mercy, all prophets. And when that mercy was continuously rejected until Allah knew that the people that are left in that town have no good left in their hearts, and only Allah could know that, then Allah would close the doors of His mercy on them, and Allah's punishment would unleash on that nation. Now, then after that nation was destroyed, the door of mercy would open again. Another prophet would come, the mercy is opened again, and then they decide that they want that door closed, and then the punishment comes again, and that cycle continues until the final messenger comes. When the final messenger comes, the people that rejected him, completely reject him, are the Quraysh. They're the ones who deserve the same divine. This is why when the Quran was being revealed in Mecca, when the Prophet was dealing with Quraysh, he would compare them to the nation of Ad and Thamud and the nation of Nuh and the nation of, the nation of Musa alayhi salam, Fir'aun, the Pharaoh. And why did he compare them to all these prophets? Because they're doing what those people did, and which means they should have the same end those people had. You understand? But this is the last prophet. And if the doors of mercy close again, are they ever going to open again? Allah Azza wa Jalla in Surah At-Tawbah closed the doors of His mercy. He said, I'm not closing it immediately, unlike other places. لَيَأْتِيَنَّهُمْ بَغْتَةً, and it'll come at them immediately. He closed those doors for the Quraysh after 4 months. You have 4 months to still enter Allah's mercy, and if not, then Allah's punishment will be unleashed on you. And you know what that means? No nation after that will ever be destroyed again. Like the Quraysh were vowed to be destroyed this time, no nation will ever be destroyed again. Why? Because no prophet is ever going to come again. Which means Allah will not give that final ultimatum to nations again the way that the Quraysh were destroyed. The only exception possibly being Bani Israel, because there's an outstanding balance. But other than that, no. There's never going to happen. It's not going to happen again. And this is Allah's mercy on all nations and all peoples. And that's why, in a sense, rahmatan lil alameen. He's a mercy and a blessing for all nations, the Prophet ﷺ is. Allah Azza wa Jalla help us understand the beauty of His surahs. Which English translation do you recommend? Of the ones I've read, I don't read many English translations, but of the ones I've read, I really like the Abdul Halim. Each translation has a certain focus. The author, Professor Abdul Halim of the Oxford University Press, his focus was on the overall flow of the text. So he's not concerned with every word and every phrase. So if you're looking for a grammatically nuanced translation, that's not it. But it's, to appreciate the Quran as a flowing text, that's a pretty decent translation. I like it a lot. Generation upon generation of memorization helped preserve the Quran. Many times, memorization without any understanding or even sense of language. It is memorization without knowledge or knowing the language all right. I personally think we have to accept reality instead of saying what's all right and what's not all right. I think kids in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, kids in Malaysia, in Indonesia, Brunei, like kids all over kids in South Africa, kids in America, Canada, England, they're memorizing the Quran without knowing Arabic. That's okay. I think what we need to do is something about that. We need to empower those children with knowledge of the Arabic language. So what they're reciting, what they're growing up with, they have an intimate, direct connection with. Man, these kids are going to recite and review Quran day in and day out, day in and day out. And man, if they knew what it meant, that means they're reviewing Allah's message over and over and over and over again. They would be the most spiritually uplifted people in the world. So why would we deprive them of that gift? We should, and instead of complaining they should just know Arabic, we need to do something about making Arabic easy to learn, to access, so that they can have access to that language, so they can grow up being empowered by this book for their lives, their families, their communities. So I see it as an opportunity. The love of memorization of Quran is simply an opportunity. At least we have that preserved. We just need to bring the Arabic back. That's all. At which time or situation or level of understanding is okay to teach or carry Quranic discussions? I've been asked many times and feel hesitant. I think knowing your limits is the best thing, right? It's the word of Allah. I remind myself and others, I'm no scholar. I'm not. I'm trying to study this stuff and teach what I understand to the best of my ability. I recognize that I'm in a learning process, and maybe I'll see things very differently a year from now, 2 years from now, because that's what students do when they study more. They They're exposed to new realities and a new phenomenon that they were unaware of before. And that's happened in my study of the Quran for 20 years. I mean, every year is like I didn't know it before. I mean, just this year, I took last year I took a course in Muscat on the Quran, and I felt like I'm studying it for the first time. It happens. But that doesn't mean until I know it, I won't teach it. There is no threshold like that. Look, the first of all, Allah knows best. Second of all, to the best of my ability, this is what it means. This is what I think it means. Have discussions, collect questions, have somebody of scholarship or someone of a little bit higher caliber that you can take questions back to. Be okay with saying, I don't know. Also, understand the purpose of halaqat like that. It's remembrance. The remembrance of Allah. And the remembrance of Allah was meant for all of humanity. It wasn't meant for academic circles. It was meant for all of humanity. It's an open spiritual message. If the jinn can hear it and say, hey, we're going to pass this along, come on, guys. You're a little more qualified than jinn. It was meant for you primarily. They happened to just pass by and hear it, and their reflections on the Quran became part of the Quran. Epic. Well, after years of studying Arabic, you still have a really tough time with the Quran simple parts. What can I recommend? Like understanding them? Well, if you have a hard time understanding them, I think maybe, I'm not saying for sure. Maybe listen to this guy, like Mullah Ali Khan, he does like a lot of Quran lectures. Maybe that'll help you like a little bit. I don't know. The guy's, he puts you to sleep really quick though. Like people come down from all over the world, Brother Numan, I go to sleep listening to your stuff. Thank you. I used to have a sleep problem before I met you. I don't anymore. So yeah, but that might help. Or whoever you listen to and not sleep. But listening to others explain the Quran will help you. It'll, especially with those parts. And then you'll remember, inshallah. In your research, have you seen an impact on Nazm when it comes to different qira'at? I want to read Farahi. Are there English material? I'm struggling to read the Arabic at the moment. I know it's hard Arabic. Boy, it's hard Arabic, but is it juicy? Man, it's like, Hamiduddin Farahi. I haven't looked at the qira'at in depth. The qira'at issue comes up when we study in our in-depth series. Alhamdulillah, we're done with 47 surahs of the in-depth series, myself and Sheikh Suhaib and some other members of the team. But I haven't looked at the impact of qira'at overall on nazm itself. I know there are some who look at it like that, and I think that Islahi even at some points argued that it couldn't have been that reading, it has to be this reading based on nazm. I will say, however, that, like there's multifaceted meanings of words, right? A word can mean multiple things. And nazm can help you narrow the meaning down to what, maybe not the only meaning, but the most convincing meaning. I'll give you an example of that. You have in Surah Al-Baqarah, about the pharaohs. يذبح أبناءكم ويستحيي نساءكم وفي ذلكم بلاء من ربكم عظيم. He was slaughtering your children, he was letting your women live, and it's translated, and in all of that there was a great trial for you. وفي ذلكم بلاء, bala means trial here. من ربكم عظيم. Interestingly, the word bala in Arabic also means blessing. Bala means blessing. Now, in that ayah, I mean, obviously he's slaughtering your children, and he's letting your women live. This has got to be trial. That's a trial. I'm actually more convinced that ayah says blessing. I find that argument more convincing. Why? It begins with Ya Bani Israel adhkuru ni'mati allati an'amtu alaykum. Make mention of the favor I did to you, Israelites. I covered you with cloud. I parted the water for you. I sent you manna and salwa. List of Allah's favors, list of Allah's favors. And then this ayah begins, إِذْ نَجَّيْنَاكُمْ مِنْ آلِ فِرْعَوْنَ. When we rescued you from the clutches of the Pharaoh. He was slaughtering your children, letting your women live. The fact that I rescued you was a great blessing. Meaning, everything before then is blessing, 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 blessing. And the point of it is, you need to be grateful. You need to acknowledge that this favor was done to you. In all of that, Allah is actually, I would argue, in this case, it's maybe not maybe not dismissing the other view, but it's an equally plausible argument that Allah is here saying the fact that I got you rescued from that mess when I parted the water for you is also an incredible blessing. Where would you have been if I didn't get you out of there? What would you have had? All of the rule that you had around the world, all of the governance that you established, none of that would have been there. You would have been a slave nation still. So context does sort of, maybe not on the qira'at level, but even on the word level, it certainly has an impact. And I would imagine that it does have an impact on qira'at. I just can't think of any case study examples of that yet. Um, As an Anglo with no Arabic, I reverted last year at the age of 73. I'm trying to learn how to read the Quran, but will not understand what I'm reading. This makes me feel that I'm not properly connecting with Allah. What can you suggest? I don't believe that you, sir, or ma'am, I don't know, are not properly connected with the Quran. That's a matter of your heart, not a matter of the Arabic language. I would suggest that you take advantage of humble efforts like mine or others to try to better appreciate the message of the Quran. You do whatever little you can to recite the Quran in Arabic, and if you can't, that's okay too. At your age, it's fine. If you're having a really hard time, don't be so hard on yourself. Allah will not ask you how was your tajweed and how was your ayn and your qaf and your kha. He's not going to ask you that. I'm pretty confident about that. What you've accepted this message, and the Prophet ﷺ wanted to take this message far and wide, and you're part of that far and wide. وَآخَرِينَ مِنْهُمْ لَمَّا يَلْحَقُوا بِهِمْ, as am I. So, Allah opens the blessing of learning this language for some, and for some they're going to struggle with it, and that's part of what Allah decreed for you, and that's okay. That's certainly okay. But that doesn't mean you can't contemplate on the message of the Quran and the words of the Quran and seek help from those who are trying to teach it. And which is why the responsibility of this ummah was not just to learn the book, but to teach it. And what that means is teach it at every level. There are scholars that are teaching coming scholars. There are people that are teaching members of the community that can only learn during a Friday sermon. They have no other opportunity to learn. They're too busy. They're living hand to mouth, have a difficult life. They're not going to be able to learn in any other time. And they have to learn whatever little they can in those 10, 15 minutes without memorizing the verses or knowing the references or knowing the Arabic. And you're not alone. The vast majority of Muslims in the world don't know the Arabic of the Quran. You're not a minority. You're part of the majority. So don't feel so isolated, inshallah. What I do recommend is some interesting readings. I think Reflections on the Quran by Islahi would be a good English read for starters, I think. Pray for me. I'm hopefully working on a translation, inshallah. We'll see. Last question for the day. A lot of times people come, and by the way, I'll take additional questions in 3 hours or 2 hours for the later session, and I won't repeat these questions. I'll take whatever outstanding questions there are and get through as many of them as I can. A lot of times people come to the Quran for finding personal solutions or comfort, just a relationship between the reader and the word of Allah. At those times, when you take each ayah as if it's spoken to you directly, is there a risk of misinterpreting the ayah by singling them out and reading out of context? Yeah, sure, there is a danger of doing that, and which is why you need some sort of mentorship. And I was reading this ayah, this is how it spoke to me. Do you think that's okay? Don't be so skeptical about that, because most of the Quran speaks in very universal language. So I wouldn't start doubting myself at every turn. But if if you're really jumping the gun at something like Allah Azza wa Jalla was talking about, like, I don't know, inheritance law and how much a mother gets, and you start thinking about your percentage in the business that you're running and no connection because you heard the word percentage and you started thinking about something else. If you're making too much of a jump, then you should know that you're making too much of a jump. But fihi dhikrukum, when Allah Himself says He's talking about you, it's mentioning you. So pondering, one thing I like telling students, and fellow seekers of the Quran. I don't even consider you guys students really. We're all just trying to get, closer to Allah's words. One of the things you can do is when you read an ayah, you ask yourself, how can you turn that into a prayer? How can you turn this ayah into a request from Allah? Any ayah. Any ayah. It's talking about nations of the past. Ya Allah, don't make mistakes like those that came before me. Don't let me suffer from even an ounce of arrogance or pride or, delusion or greed, or keep me safe from these things. You're reading something about the people of the book, and among them there are good. Ya Allah, let me see the good in them. So just turn everything you're reading, turn it into a conversation with Allah. You're telling me this, so clearly you want me to ask you something of Allah's, because we asked Allah for guidance. So why don't we keep asking Him? As we read the book, we keep asking Him, and that'll really further and benefit our relationship with. And it's one last thing on the page, so I guess I'll just touch it. No, there's a lot more. No, I will come back inshallah, and in the 2 hours from now, the next QA session, I will try to address the remainder of these questions. Really wonderful questions. Thank you so much. I'm really benefiting, and hopefully you guys are too. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the course. I'm very happy that this was put together. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum. And by the way, if you're enjoying the course by the end of it, I want to know if you like this format and you want me to continue to do more courses like this, because I'm thinking hopefully up to 3 courses a year of this kind, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bye. Bye. Bye.